Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming to this interview. I really appreciate you setting aside the time. So, for my sake, for the sake of anyone who might be listening, could you briefly introduce yourself, your personal background, academic background, and what you're doing now?
Okay, my name is Sezgi Güler. I am an attorney at law. I currently work as an in-house counsel at Axion International, which is a nonprofit, and we make impact investments all over the world. So I work globally. I studied law in Istanbul University, and then I did my LLM in banking and financial law at Boston University.
Yeah. Well, to sort of get us started, why did you choose the law? I mean, there are a lot of choices when you're 18 going into college. Why was this your calling?
Yeah, because when I was in high school, I was very interested in philosophy and especially in ethics. So my parents convinced me, so to speak, to study law and go to law school because there are a lot of overlaps between the two disciplines. And so that's been my calling.
And then why take that step, outside of Turkey? You could have stayed, you could have said, well, I'll be the best lawyer that Turkey's ever seen, but you decided to study abroad as well. So why make that choice?
Because I've always wanted to explore different perspectives in all areas of law, in terms of different cultures, in terms of professional approaches, law, the legal systems. That's why I thought I needed to expand my horizon a little bit in that sense professionally. So that's why I ended up moving abroad and studying abroad and working abroad.
Hmm. And as you expanded your horizon to a totally different country, culture, language, how was that experience? Was it an easy experience of transition? Did you find there were any, particular differences that stood out to you?
Oh, well, of course. Well, I was pretty confident when I relocated to the United States because I assumed that I was very familiar with the culture and the language and the education style. I was already aware that, in US law schools, I needed to be prepared for classes, and I was okay with that. But when I moved here and actually attended the classes, the atmosphere was completely different from what I've experienced in Turkey in academia. Because in Istanbul University, we had crowded classes, right? We had like 100 or more students. So class participation and discussions were very limited. But in the US, it was the norm and it was the expectation. Especially now, John, you're probably familiar with the Socratic method that where your professors call you out and ask you questions, and they expect you to be able to discuss and even debate certain issues. And that was a challenge for me because I wasn't very used to, speaking up in classes. I was a very timid and shy student, and I looked up to my professors. I thought they were, the most amazing people in the world. So I was kind of challenged when I saw in the US that, you were able to debate with your professors. I took some classes with the JD students, and when I watched their interactions with each other, I've noticed that it was very different than what I've experienced in Turkey, but it was not disrespectful either, because that was sort of the way of, learning and teaching and interacting with each other. Like disagreements and debate was sort of the expectation.
What was the sort of adjustment to that like? I mean, you said, of course, it's different, but was it like a particularly easy sort of, well, I'll just emulate what they're doing, or did you feel as though it was more of a deeper, oh, wow, that this sort of, I have this respect for the professor, but I have to speak to them more as equals now?
Yeah. So I think that was sort of a mindset shift for me there, right? When I observed those interactions, yes, I tried to emulate them when, especially, I was interacting with the professors that I found more friendly, or the classes I liked a little bit more. So I
Mhm.
started slowly coming out of my shell, so to speak, and, starting to voice my opinions. And then from there, it really took off. I've noticed that it was, much more fun to be in the class like that. It was very engaging. And, were paying a lot of tuition, so I wanted to make the most out of my buck too. So I felt that, that was a more beneficial way to be. But yeah, in the beginning, I think it did take some time to change that mindset and making those internal adjustments, to be more proactive or to be more outgoing, I guess.
And as you sort of look back on those different transitional experiences, how you adapted, how you grew through these, how do you think they changed your sort of not just personal, but professional development? I mean, do you find yourself in a much different place now, or would you say, it contributed X amount to my being Y right now?
Absolutely, definitely. Because in Turkey, to give you a little bit of a background about my career, I was a junior attorney at a law firm, which is a very different setting than where I am right now. Now I'm an in-house counsel, so that's a completely different setting. But now I can refer back to those moments where I was interacting with my professors, speaking up in a class. Now that is the norm during my day-to-day job because, I have to work with senior management. I have to have collaborative relationships with my colleagues. And in terms of like making that tonal switch or like stylistic change, I think that helped with my career in the US a lot because in Turkey, I was, a little bit maybe narrow-minded in the sense that how I interact with my clients, how I interact with people. Here, I feel like I'm more, direct, I'm more friendly. And I think the education I got in Boston University has a huge impact on how I carry out myself as a professional.
Speaking to that friendliness in the different sort of political, not political, professional contexts, what do you think that sort of says about the different systems? I mean, do you think it reflects some deeper cultural values? And if so, what would those be in your mind?
It certainly does. I think in the US, people are much more direct as compared to Turkey. Especially in the professional setting. In Turkey, I found myself when I needed to express an idea, it was usually embellished with professional, jargon. It was very indirect. But in here, people are much more pragmatic. They're not going to listen to you for an hour for you to, make your point. So, I think the other thing is that people are very outcome oriented here rather than the process as compared to Turkey. So I think that is kind of the cultural difference between the two jurisdictions.
Yeah. So I think we've sort of gone into this cultural area, but I want to bring us back a little bit to perhaps the educational side, if you wouldn't mind for a second. And I sort of want to ask, we've spoken about these sort of oral components of legal education and the professional side, speaking, debating, but I want to, ask you about the writing side as well. Do you find that there were any particular challenges in sort of transitioning from a more Turkish language and culture and legal system oriented writing to an American style?
Of course, as I was mentioning, the style in Turkey tends to be a little bit more indirect. And when I was communicating as a law firm associate, I would, for example, refer to a lot of different laws and regulations, and I was a little bit more rigid in terms of their implications and how you apply that to a given set of facts. But here I feel like, I'm much more flexible in terms of, communicating and um, in writing too, I started to be much more concise. I use bullet points a lot. And I find it very useful when I'm especially interacting with people who are not lawyers. So my written communication style definitely has evolved over time. And I guess the other thing is that I don't need to write memos or I don't need to like write petitions. So for that reason, my communication style is usually focused on communicating information in the most straightforward way rather than, trying to persuade a judge or an arbitrator. So I think that's a major change I have also observed in my written communication style.
So when we speak about these sort of different communication styles, I would assume that they're not like entirely separate, that they're traces of the Turkish style when you write in English and the English style when you write in Turkish. So I'd wonder, what would you say would be the sort of things that could stand out as saying, well, perhaps, there are some influences that are not American in this email you've written, or if you do write a memo in this memo you've written, would there be anything that you think would sort of carry across from your previous Turkish education?
I think not anymore because I've spent the majority of my career in the US at this
Mhm.
point. But I see those traces in other lawyers' way of communication who are not US trained and who are not Turkish. For example, I do a lot of deals with Indian lawyers, and I feel that they have a very similar style with the Turkish lawyers, right? They're very thorough. They're very, as I was mentioning earlier, process oriented. They're very detail oriented. Whereas US lawyers find that style a little bit more daunting. So I think the Turkish cultural background in that sense helped me navigate those types of different styles in other people and, being able to notice those patterns and respond to those types of patterns.
So I want to dig in on something you said because I'm very curious in the sort of outcome versus process oriented law
Uh-huh.
cultures, perhaps.
Yeah.
Perhaps this is just my intuition, but I feel as though you wouldn't pay a lawyer to lose a case, and if they're going thoroughly in the process, I feel as though all lawyers would, to some extent, have to be outcome oriented because they're getting paid to win a case. So why is there this sort of distinction in your mind? I mean, what does the sort of process oriented mean for a client or for a lawyer as they look at themselves?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking in a manner of how you communicate certain ideas. Yes, at the end of the day, we're all interested in clients' best interests. But when you hear back from a lawyer who comes from a civil law jurisdiction, usually, when they're trying to explain their analysis to you, convey their points, they start with like, the Big Bang, like giving a lot of context and explaining like what led to the other thing and what their analysis is. But in the US context, I think you sort of like start, at least that's my style. I don't know, there may be other lawyers who have a different preference, but you start with the punchline, right? This is the outcome, and this is why I think this is my analysis, like this is why I think this is the outcome. But you focus on the conclusion more than the analysis process, I guess. It doesn't mean to say that US lawyers don't analyze. We always do, but I guess that's how you frame things differently as a lawyer.
And in sort of explaining that, you said civil law lawyers might have this sort of more analysis focused or starting with the Big Bang. Do you think it's associated with the sort of law system, civil versus common law? Or do you think it's a more cultural? So, what would be the sort of, I mean, why do you think that is? Why is a code-based sort of law system more process oriented than like a previous case-based one?
It is more prescriptive because, you have the laws that applies to a certain event. It's less flexible. So you are constrained in that sense. But I think the common law jurisdictions tend to evolve a little bit faster and they tend to be more reactive and responsive to the realities. So your starting point, like in terms of, you know, in lawmaking, in my view, like your starting point is a set of facts, then you start building principles out of that, patterns of facts. Whereas in civil law jurisdictions, it is a little bit abstract. You start building laws and then start applying to the events. I don't know. That's my take on the difference between the two systems.
Right. Fair enough. So perhaps taking a bigger picture look at this and moving on to this more of like a cultural aspect of it, of the legal practice in your experience. Do you feel as though, because of these different systems, because of the different expectations from clients, that lawyers see themselves differently in these two systems? I mean, what are the sort of roles and responsibilities that a Turkish lawyer might see for themselves versus an American lawyer versus perhaps an Indian lawyer?
Yeah, I guess this could be again due to my, transition from a law firm to an in-house role, but in Turkey, based on my observations, lawyers are subject matter experts, right? You gotta know the law, you gotta perform an accurate analysis, and people don't expect you to chime in on business-related matters or non-legal matters. But in the US, you're more like a business partner to your clients. Sometimes there are non-legal issues. So you gotta be a great lawyer, you got to be a good subject matter expert. In addition to that, you need to understand the non-legal aspects of what you're dealing with. For example, I find it very helpful when there is like a, let's say, dispute that we can't move forward with the counterparty's attorney. And I start to, look for reasons other than legal reasons why that could be the case. It could be a relationship issue, it could be a timing issue, it could be a miscommunication issue. So, in addition to the legal matters, I pay attention to those patterns as well. And I find it very helpful if you're kind of having a deadlock with the lawyer, you always ask the business principals to have a business conversation because lawyers have an interest in getting a deal done, but the business principals are, they have a more, I think compared to the lawyers, they have a greater vetted benefit or interest in getting something done. So when you put them kind of, when you ask them to communicate and solve their own issues, then it kind of, I think it has like the impact on the legal problems as well. Then you get unstuck somehow. So, yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. And sort of as you've now evolved and grown as a lawyer in this different professional context, how do you sort of feel navigating these differences? I mean, do you find yourself naturally now sort of occupying the role of that business partner? Or do you ever
Yeah.
find yourself thinking, wow, I have to be the subject matter expert. I have to know this one area of law perfectly. Perhaps exaggerating a little bit, but sort of where do you land in your perception of yourself within those two ends?
Yeah, I think I'm definitely a business partner and a team member, a member of the business team rather than the legal team sometimes. Because
Mhm.
when I first started my in-house role, I was pretty much in the law firm mindset, right? I remember reviewing a contract with my clients, and there was this provision that was just like unacceptable to me as a lawyer because it carried a lot of risk. And the way I communicated that concern was very um, aggressive in a sense, right? But then my senior lawyer started reviewing my work and like we were in the same meeting with the client and started talking through the issues. And I've noticed that the points I raised were technically correct and they were, yes, they carried legal risk. But for the context of the relationship, maybe it was not the first priority. And the interest of the client in that sense was not that legal issue that I was very stuck on. It was more of building that relationship, fostering that relationship with the counterparty so that they can have more business relationships in the future. So, I think that was an aha moment for me. It was very early in my in-house role that, where I understood that my role was not to just narrowly focus on legal matters and think of the business aspects of it as well.
I know. And sort of as we round out this more cultural discussion, and before we head into perhaps how, your experience might influence others who might be wishing to pursue similar paths, I'd sort of want to ask, we often talk about, and in this sort of experience that you talked about, the in-house transition, how, previous experience might be a hindrance to learning a new context of how, I come from a different system, I need to adapt. But I
Mhm.
do want to ask, have you ever had any experiences where sort of this maybe Turkish education or this, previous law firm experience were benefits to you in terms of how you handle the situation? Perhaps bicultural, bilinguistic, all these different sort of backgrounds. Have they ever been an asset to you in how you address challenges?
I think so. It definitely does. So if you want to transition, between those types of roles, you definitely need to keep an open mind and not assume that you know the best way to handle things. And it doesn't matter if you are a junior attorney or you're more seasoned. You just need to have that adaptability and the flexibility, right? Otherwise, life is going to be very difficult. Um, because like there are so many different ways of doing things, right? Professionally or otherwise. And you gotta keep an open mind about or be receptive to those different ways of doing things and incorporate those methods into your thinking to the extent that resonates with you or your style. So I think being a multicultural lawyer is a very important asset nowadays, especially, in a global attorney context. Um, I do find it very helpful in the sense that, because you experience those cultural tension points or sometimes even conflicts, I think it makes one more sensitive towards those types of issues. Like it's sort of like an issue spotting skill. If you're having a cultural tension point, you're like, oh yeah, like I had this before and now this is happening in this context again. So I see it, for example, between the communications. We have an office in India. That's why I'm talking about India a lot. But we have a US trained, US citizen, US based lawyer, and he worked internationally before, but he didn't work with India as much in the past. And I see it, for example, in his interactions with our friends in India that sometimes he's missing those cultural nuances and it confuses him. It sometimes frustrates him. But as an international lawyer, you tend to have a keen eye for those types of differences, right? You notice them, and I think it lets you proactively address them as well so that you save time and money.
So I do want to sort of get your definition on one thing very quickly. So, working for an organization that's not so domestic, but very much more global, and yourself now having used the word an international lawyer, I just want to sort of get your perspective on that. What does that sort of word mean to you? I mean, is a domestic lawyer someone who practices one law, or is an international lawyer someone who practices perhaps in different jurisdictions, or is it more a perspective kind of matter, or is it a mentality kind of matter? What sort of leads you to define those two differently?
I think that is definitely a matter of mentality and perspective. Even if you're a local divorce attorney or like an estate attorney, you can still have a lot of resources, at your service. Like we have the internet, we have like lawyer groups, we have LinkedIn groups, we have networking events, there are webinars. There is a lot of ways to challenge your thinking and, a lot of ways to get information and different perspectives. And, maybe you're not going to go and do a research about like, marriage laws or divorce laws in Korea, but, it kind of like gives you the ability to maybe improve your skills that are not dependent on jurisdiction, right? It doesn't have to be about the word of the law or rule of the law, but it could be your style, it could be your, approach to legal matters. So I think the opportunities are endless, and one does not need to work internationally necessarily to be a part of the international community of lawyers.
So, looking at that sort of international community of lawyers, as you look also forward into the next 5, 10, maybe 20 years of your career, what do you sort of hope to contribute to that setting? Perhaps areas that are weak in that sort of cross-border, cross-cultural, cross-jurisdiction, cross-language. A lot of different things change when you practice in different areas. But what do you hope to bring to that sort of arena?
I think knowledge sharing is very important. As I was mentioning, there are a lot of channels where you can do that, where you can exchange ideas. Um, and yeah, I think mostly that. And I was thinking about, when you were asking me this question, how those connections can be very meaningful in very real ways. That I'll give you this example. Like 5 or 6 years ago, I met this lawyer from Nigeria in New York in a networking event. Like, who would have thought that we would reconnect, right? But 5 years later, now today we're closing a deal in Nigeria, and I was urgent need of a local legal counsel to do the due diligence work. And thanks to my connection, that process was handled very seamlessly. So that type of collaboration among lawyers, being willing to share what you know and your resources and your connections have real tangible benefits.
Sort of as we wrap up and with respect to your time, looking back on all of your experiences on, being a Turkish law student, then going abroad, now working abroad, what sort of advice would you give to a Turkish young lawyer or an aspiring law student, perhaps, who might want to follow in your career path, who might be inspired after hearing your story? I mean, how could they perhaps vicariously learn through your experience in navigating their own path forward?
hmm I think for that one, I have an article that talks about that topic in detail, but I think in summary, just be very mindful of the steps you're taking about your career. I get a lot of, outreach from Turkish law students or, other foreign law students about, hey, how did you do this? How did you do that? It's all great, to be reaching out to people with those questions, but a theme that I'm starting to notice is that people want to practice in other jurisdictions because they want to live abroad or they have more like self-serving type of like ideas about, just leaving one country and moving to another. I think that is not the right way to look at it. You need to be mindful in the sense that what do you want to contribute to this world? What could be the ways for you to have the most impactful career for yourself and for others, and look into that and go from there. I think, yeah.
You sort of wrap up in all of the things that we've spoken about. Would there be one, if someone is watching just these last 45, maybe minute, 45 seconds a minute of this conversation, would there be one, insight, one experience, one story that you would like to highlight as the most important of what you've mentioned?
Oh, yes. I think would be my professor Tamar Frankel, who's going to be 100 years old in this 4th of July. She is one of the, I think, if not the first female lecturer at Boston University School of Law, and in an area that is male dominated, like finance and financial law. I had the privilege and the opportunity to work with her for a little bit. We wrote a few articles together, and we started developing this personal relationship. And she was born in Israel. She came to the US as an adult, just like myself. And when we were, talking, sometimes I would realize that decades ago, she had this experience that really speaks to my current experience, which is very interesting. Because, at times, one of the most challenging thing, maybe to go back to one of your questions, for me was working on my accent. Like I didn't do anything actually actively to work on my accent, but I was really worried about it. And it really caused me a lot of mental, like, exhaustion. And I was really anxious in all of the business settings I was in for a little bit. And she had a similar experience too. Like when she first came to the US and started teaching, her students started to complain about her accent, so she actually had to take private classes to, to maybe improve to be better understood by her students. So I thought that was very interesting. And the challenges she endured as a female attorney was also very meaningful and something I still relate to, I think.
Thank you for all of your insights. Thank you for everything that you've shared. Unless you have something else burning, I'm just going to very quickly end the recording.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.